one of my other really happy places is what we see with cognitive function. So the statistics are that 60% of women, at least according to Dr. Mosconi's group out of the Weil Center, 60% of women experience brain fog as they go through menopause. We think of it as the loss of estrogen. So Dr. Mosconi's group came out with a study weeks ago where they had done imaging, and so nuclear imaging, looking at the brain, starting with women prior to menopause, so, reproductive, perimenopause, and menopause. And for the first time ever, they showed that their receptors for estrogen were increasing in number. Now, the dogma and the belief prior to this study was that as we go through menopause, the loss of estrogen caused a loss of these receptors in the brain, and that was part of the brain fog.
Ladies, are you ready to take control of your menopause journey? Introducing Mastering the Pause, the ultimate ebook that empowers you with the knowledge and tools to navigate this transformative phase with confidence and grace. Packed with expert guidance on hormone replacement, essential lab tests, personalized diet and lifestyle strategies, this book is your secret weapon to combat menopause-related challenges. Discover how to maintain a healthy metabolism, ward off belly fat, and embrace this new chapter of your life. Download your copy now at guide.hormoneshelp.com. That's guide.hormoneshelp.com. And let's make this a smooth and informed menopause transition today.
So last week, an article came out, and I quote, that testosterone therapy has gone too far. We've got to put an end, basically, to testosterone therapy in women. And number one, this couldn't be any farther from the truth. And number two, we're going to dispel all of the myths about testosterone being just a quote and unquote male hormone, and that it's not important in women. And, the other side of it is the FDA had been a dismal failure in women's health, and particularly around testosterone therapy and how important it may be to women. So today we're going to dig in, talk about what you need to know about testosterone, why it's important to women's health, and how it may be playing a role, or lack of it may be playing a role in your health concerns. All right, so the first thing we got to talk about, what is the measurement of testosterone between women and men? So number one, depending on the lab you're looking at, so most labs have a testosterone range between about 7 to about 82 for women. It varies a little bit by lab. That is done in nanograms per deciliter. Now, comparatively to men make about 10 times that amount than women, right? So a man's level on the low end is going to be about 350 up to, 900 to about 1150 is what we often see when we look at a man's level. So yes, women make testosterone. We make a lot less than men, but we do make testosterone, and it is vastly important. It gets overlooked, and a lot of women don't think that it's important, is because we use different levels of measure to look at estradiol, which is your ovarian estrogen, that protective hormone that's associated with all the protective effects of estrogen. And it's typically measured in picograms. And picograms equal 0.001 nanograms, right? So let me say that again. Picograms equate to 0.001 nanograms. So 1 nanogram equals 1,000 picograms. Testosterone is measured, particularly in the United States, as nanograms per deciliter, right? So if we were to compare them, we would have to look at the same unit of measure. So a lot of times when you're looking at your labs and you're trying to figure out what your levels are, you see, a testosterone level of 5, and you see, let's say, an estradiol level of, let's say, 45, because you're still cycling, and you think, oh, that testosterone is really not that important. But the measurement should be 1,000 of that for testosterone rather than looking at estrogen. So the reality is we make between 3 and 5 times the amount of testosterone at any given time than we do estrogen. And it has a profound effect on women's health. And the idea that it's just a male hormone is so frighteningly antiquated and misogynistic that we need to rearrange and get rid of this as part of our argument for women's health, because it actually has impact. And so I'm going to dig in and unpack that today. So number one, testosterone levels vary, but they don't vary as much over the course of our cycle. So if we look at cycling women and when we're still menstruating, testosterone levels may remain pretty stable, so they don't really fluctuate that much. Now, estrogen fluctuates quite a bit because action of follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the pituitary glands. So it dramatically changes. So the ratio changes a little bit throughout the month. Like estrogen is going to climb during ovulation, and it's going to climb in that second half of the cycle, which is called your luteal, right before you have your period. But again, testosterone stays pretty stable. And even though the levels are much higher in testosterone, again, it stays pretty stable. But the reality is, as we approach menopause, estrogen levels decline, and so do the levels of testosterone, right? And that can alter the ratio. But once we hit like a complete flat line of estrogen, our androgens, testosterone being one of them, but we have DHEA sulfate, androstenedione, androsterone, all of these other sort of what we're going to call male hormones or androgens are often a little bit higher relative to estrogen. But the overall effect is testosterone is also depleted. It is also much, much lower. So the idea that we don't need any androgens and we don't need any DHEA or testosterone is completely antiquated. So where does the FDA stand on this measure? So the FDA, as of this recording in 2024, the FDA has only approved testosterone therapy for women for sexual dysphoric disorder. Oh my gosh, I love ICD-10 codes. These are the codes that we label people with so medical people can get paid. And we come up with really elaborate names, and we start with syndromes, and then we create a disease state, and then we create drugs for it. Usually the drug development has started that whole labeling effect, and then you get labeled with it, and then the FDA does or doesn't approve something. So sexual disorder is a super fancy way of saying you don't really feel like having sex. You have a low libido. And so far, that's the way the FDA views testosterone for women, that it is solely so you can perform sexual acts and be interested in doing it. Now, I'll be the first to say it is highly important to have a comfortable and healthy sex life. I think that is healthy, and especially throughout our lifespan. It's such an important part, our sense of pleasure and enjoyment. It is an essential part of us being in touch with our body, and it is an essential part of relationships. And so I also think that sexuality and the desire for sex is really important on both sides of the equation, regardless of your sexual orientation or desire. I think it's really important to have a strong life. And it is, really uncomfortable for most women when we start to go through perimenopause and all of a sudden we're like, man, I'd rather get, a pedicure than have sex. Or, I have so little interest in it, I'll come up with something else to do. So I'm tied up, so I don't have to have that uncomfortable sort of conversation with my significant other. Stories I hear all the time in clinic, and their experiences I've experienced, because as our hormones start to decline, I like to tell the men that it's kind of like we go back to about 9 years old. We don't really happier because our hormones are flatlined. So sexual desire is important, but it is by no means the only part of this equation. And, when we have studies looking at replacing testosterone in women, so restoring it back to a physiological dose, lo and behold, yes, sexual interest often is improved. But what I would say is that sexual interest woman is between the ears, not between the legs, right? So this is the other side of it, is often we will be into sexual relations and intimacy once we've been warmed up like a nice pot of water to slowly come to boil. We don't have spontaneous sexual interest in most cases. That's not how women are wired generally. And so we warm up to it, but we're not often the one that's going to initiate it. And especially for women in this time period of life, that actual activity is going to decline quite a bit. And it causes a lot of disruption to relationships. We see the highest amount of divorce happening in our 40s and 50s. And I believe, and I think the data do support this, that a lot of times it's not just, hey, we spent, 20 years raising children and making our career happen. And when the kids started to empty nest, all of a sudden, we don't know who each other are anymore. And we've fallen out of relationship and fallen out of love. I think a lot of it is also sexual chemistry disruption. Our hormones are declining rapidly. Men's hormones decline, but not to the same degree. And we have a sexual mismatch. And I think that is a huge problem no one talks about. I think it's really important because again, it's not so much even just having that as a beautiful part of your life. It's actually really important to your health, right? So I want you to also think of testosterone and your androgens as part of your sexual picture, that it's not just about your interest in sex. We're going to go into that right here, right now. All right. So number one, why is testosterone important to women's health? So here's the information, and I'm going to support it with some research. Number one, I'm just going to start and kind of move through the data. So bone health. So bone health is obviously really important to men and women, but women carry an increased risk for osteopenia and osteoporosis because of the loss of estrogen in our lifespan. So all women experience bone loss as they go through perimenopause, particularly if they haven't restored hormones by replacing them with bioidentical hormones. And so the degree in which that bone loss occurs depends on what they started with. So as women, we max out our bone density in most cases by about 30 to 35, and then we have a steady decrease. Now, as soon as you go into menopause and lose all of your estrogen, the stimulus to the osteoblasts, which are think of those as the construction crew that help you build bone, they go home. They don't show up. There's just a few guys that show up every day and they sort of put some bricks in, but they're not really working hard. However, the osteoclasts, the demolition crew, are tearing down building rapidly. And it's the loss of estrogen that drives that. Well, what's interesting is if we look at the literature, testosterone also has this supporting effect on bone mineral density and osteoblast activity, so the construction crew. And it's not nearly to the same degree as estradiol, but when you look at studies in men, if you suppress testosterone and or suppressed estradiol by giving an estrogen disrupting drug or an aromatase inhibitor to a man, you can actually induce bone mineral loss in a man as well. And so testosterone can stimulate osteoblasts. And because testosterone can be converted to estrogen, albeit not nearly to the degree in the fat cells, we can actually make estrogen out of testosterone in our fat cells. But we also do that in our ovaries. When our ovaries are at full capacity during fertility, testosterone actually gets made into estrogen, particularly estradiol. Now that declines when you go through menopause, and so our fat cells start to do it. Now, I'm going to tell you really honestly, as somebody that looks at a lot of labs over the last 2 decades, we don't really see a ton of estrogen production off of testosterone when testosterone has been replaced in a woman to a physiological dose. Not these crazy high levels, but a true physiological dose. So the take home is for bone health, testosterone in itself is important to bone reconstruction, but it may also have this positive effect by slightly improving estrogen production and increasing osteoblast activity, which is the crew that comes and builds the bone. Right? And there's a ton of research. Mohammed and colleagues in 2016 did a great literature review of what does that mean and what's really happening. So the next one is, let's get to probably the one most people thinking about. So muscle mass and muscle strength, right? So testosterone and our androgens, which are the best friends of testosterone, DHEA, androstenedione, androsterone, they help maintain and build muscle mass. And that is true in men and women. And we have this perception that that is something that happened in men and women don't do that. And the other misconception is women do testosterone therapy, they'll all of a sudden bulk up and look like a female Arnold Schwarzenegger. That is so far from the truth that you'd have to take male levels, talking 10 times the physiological dose to even get into the ballpark range of significant muscle mass increase and size increase. And there was a really great study published by the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology in 2019 by Davis and colleagues that looked at testosterone therapy in women and particularly the myths and misconceptions. So testosterone, because it's an anabolic hormone, helps stimulate your powerhouse, so your mitochondrial biogenesis, and muscle fibrillary, so think of that as a muscle fiber growth. Right? That's what it does. And so it helps your body rebuild muscle after you tear it down by exercising. And that's actually what exercise does. It helps you build muscle by kind of causing damage, so then you go rebuild it. So putting testosterone back in women actually helps us maintain muscle mass and muscle strength. So one of the biggest concerns for frailty and especially accidental death. So death that comes from an accident often is from a bone break first, because somebody gets frail from that, might end up with an infection or laid up in bed for a long period of time, and then they lose even more muscle mass, is this frailty from the loss of muscle. So one of the biggest determinants of your long-term health span is how much muscle you carry. I don't care if you're 5'1" and 100 pounds, 5'10" and 160 pounds. The more muscle you have on your frame, the better your lifespan is going to be, generally speaking, statistically. And so muscle mass is really important. So testosterone helps women build this muscle mass. Now, one of my other really happy places is what we see with cognitive function. So the statistics are that 60% of women, at least according to Dr. Mosconi's group out of the Weil Center, 60% of women experience brain fog as they go through menopause. We think of it as the loss of estrogen. So Dr. Mosconi's group came out with a study weeks ago where they had done imaging, and so nuclear imaging, looking at the brain, starting with women prior to menopause, so, reproductive, perimenopause, and menopause. And for the first time ever, they showed that their receptors for estrogen were increasing in number. Now, the dogma and the belief prior to this study was that as we go through menopause, the loss of estrogen caused a loss of these receptors in the brain, and that was part of the brain fog. Well, there is brain fog because there's a loss of estrogen, but even more importantly, the brain is so desperate for what little estrogen is circulating around that it makes more keyholes for the estrogen key to go in. So this now is a huge paradigm shift because, of course, I read that and I go, great. Now we understand that the brain is so desperate for estrogen that it's going to create a bunch of receptors for the keys that says, hey, give me the key of estrogen. So I think of that and I go, okay, where else is that occurring? We just don't know, right? Is it really that all the symptoms we experience in menopause and perimenopause are signs of the body's starvation for these hormones rather than the loss of the hormones causing a sort of drying up of receptors? So testosterone is also really important here, and it plays a role in cognitive function and memory. And a lot of this is also through its stimulation of your catecholamines. So those are the neurotransmitters that we think of for excitability and anticipation, but they're also really important to attention and focus and memory, particularly dopamine. So testosterone is a stimulus for dopamine and helps the dopamine receptors work in the brain. And dopamine not only is what you get when you, shop for a pair of shoes. Actually, just talking about shopping for shoes gives you anticipatory excitement, which is a big hit of dopamine. And then when we buy them, we get a hit of dopamine. Testosterone plays a role in that. So testosterone is very important to that dopamine and motor activities too, with motor skills with dopamine, and also plays a role with acetylcholine, which helps solidify memories. And that's one of the areas in Alzheimer's that we see damage. So testosterone and cognitive function is really important. And there was another study that came out in 2006, the European Journal of Endocrinology, and it's basically a systematic review of the current evidence of the relationship. So we've known about testosterone and its impact to cognitive function for a very long time. So testosterone is not only important to men's cognition, but also women's. And I would say when you couple the loss of estrogen with the slow decline of testosterone, we're going to see a more profound effect. One of the things that we see clinically over the last 20 years is a lot of times women will say, and men, but particularly women, they'll go, I just feel more me. Like I got some motivation that I didn't have before. I can get my butt out of bed and get things done. I'm on top of my to-do list. And that is in direct response to testosterone therapy. Now, the next one is libido and sexual function. Yes, I didn't put this one first because I don't consider this one the most important one by any stretch of the matter. But testosterone is crucial for libido and sexual function in women, not only interest, but also orgasm. And so testosterone has been studied. And what's interesting is when we look at the study of dosing, so the other thing is a lot of doctors will tell you, since the FDA hasn't approved it, you can't have it. It's only for sexual disorder. And, the dose, you can't have very much. Well, there was some studies that were done, and you can look this up on Harvard, actually has a great, layman-friendly article about it. But they looked at 5 milligrams and 10 milligrams of dosing for women. and particularly around sexual desire. And they found that for many women, 5 milligrams a day was adequate to really stimulate sexual desire, and then all the way up to 10 milligrams. So testosterone treatment absolutely has a place in sexual desire and libido. But again, I would consider that one of the lower groups, one of the least important things. Not that it's not important to us, but it is by far not the most important aspect of women's health. Weirman and the colleagues in 2014 in the Journal of Sexual Medicine has a really good article looking at hypoactive sexual desire disorder in postmenopausal women. And that's where a lot of the basic studies would show that, hey, we use some testosterone on board. Now, I alluded to this next one, which is mood and well-being. So testosterone may improve mood and well-being in women by actually stimulating not only sexual desire and climactic opportunities, right? The fact that we can enjoy and find pleasure in sex, but because it has that sort of stimulating effect to the utilization of dopamine, it very much has an effect on mood and motivation. And so, often women, I see this mostly in our perimenopausal women that we work with that may still be sleeping, but their testosterone is already on a decline. That often when they get a little bit of replenishment of testosterone, they're just like, boy, I feel more like me. I feel better. And so we've had a lot of research looking at this as well. Worsley and their team in 2017 in Climactic Journal is what it's called. They looked at, the article was Testosterone Treatment and Mood in Postmenopausal Women. This is a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis looks at all of the studies out there and tries to pull together all the data to create a consensus. And the consensus in this document showed that, hey, we should probably consider improving mood and overall well-being in women, and we should consider using testosterone as therapy. Now, I think this is vitally important because the statistics are that 1 in 5 women will experience depression during the perimenopause to menopause transition and beyond, and 1 in 3 experience anxiety. Mental health symptoms, mood symptoms are a significant portion of what we feel in this time, and testosterone absolutely plays a role in supporting a positive mood and well-being. Now, the next one might shock you, cardiovascular health, right? Stroke risk. So testosterone may have a beneficial effect on cardiovascular health in women, and it's through multiple mechanisms. So because it is supportive to the cardiac muscle and it is supportive to the body's motivation and mood and muscle building, testosterone also has actually been shown to help cardiovascular function. Now, some of this mechanism may also be through its basic conversion to estradiol. So testosterone, like I said before, can be converted to estradiol in the ovaries. We have an enzyme called aromatase that does that. And it can also be done in our fat cells. Again, that's a very way our body tries to protect us by giving us estrogen. Well, estradiol is very important to the sublayer, so right under the surface of your arteries, called the intima. And that is, think of that as a muscular layer. So when we are perimenopausal and still cycling, we're, let's say, premenopausal, estrogen is helping remodel that tissue and protect that tissue from arterial plaquing, right? So the creation of lipids into the blood vessel. Now, when we go into perimenopause and menopause and we lose testosterone in a slow drain and also lose that production of estrogen, the remodeling slows down and we see basically an increase in arterial plaquing, which makes us age match men for risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke and heart attack. And it's because we're no longer sort of protecting that arterial lining. And so testosterone has this beneficial effect. There's a endocrine and diabetes and obesity journal, and Davis and colleagues in 2015 had a good article called Testosterone and Cardiovascular Disease in Women that outlines this overall effect. So testosterone can also be helpful for cardiovascular disease. Sometimes doctors will also say that there's a risk for cardiovascular disease because of the increased production of red blood cells. So let me dispel that myth. So number one, we do make red blood cells. Testosterone can stimulate the production of more red blood cells. Now, often we see this in men, right? They'll make more red blood cells than what we need, and then we have to basically donate blood to reduce the red blood cell count. That never really happens in women. And again, especially if you're just doing physiological doses, the doses that you would be making when you're under normal circumstances and cycling, like let's say in your 30s. I have yet to ever see that clinically in a woman where we see this increase in red blood cell production that might make think of it as your blood is too thick because of the number of red blood cells. That doesn't happen in women. That is very specific to men because, again, they carry more red blood cells, they have more blood volume, and they have 10 times the amount of testosterone that we do and way beyond what would be given in a treatment scenario. So dispel that myth. Testosterone does not create that in women. Now, body composition. So this is really important because it's all about timing. So again, because it can help us increase muscle strength and muscle mass, it can help with body composition. However, it is really important that testosterone therapy in women, particularly if we're in that latter stage of perimenopause and menopause, be balanced with the estrogens. So one of the things that I think is problematic, and I see it a lot in people who are just get to treating hormones in the marketplace, there's a lot of doctors and clinicians really that are just learning how to do this and starting to do it, is there's been this overwhelming messaging to men and women that, oh, you just add testosterone, that's all you really need, and that's going to help you get lean. Well, testosterone in a man, when you take it up to the physiological experience of the man, which is usually in the higher end of that range, they will lean out. They will lose body fat. In a woman, particularly a woman cycling, so they still have some estrogen on board. It may not be as much as what they need, but they still have estrogen on board. Testosterone therapy, particularly if they have some insulin resistance and some other metabolic derangement, can actually cause weight gain in women because testosterone is an anabolic hormone and it can drive IGF-1, which is your growth hormone, insulin-like growth hormone, and drive some more insulin resistance. So it is not the panacea in all women, which is why it's so important that if you're working with somebody that's going to restore hormones, they understand the metabolic effect of these hormones and how to do it properly. More testosterone is not better in women. It's just not true and not biologically true. However, particularly in a woman who's menopausal and postmenopausal, having adequate testosterone up in that physical level where they would have been in their 30s actually improves body composition by increasing muscle strength, muscle mass, and the number of pounds of muscle you have, which then makes you more metabolically active and more able to burn fat because muscle burns fat. Okay, which brings me to the next little piece. Insulin resistance, right? So insulin resistance is when your body is no longer listening to the message of insulin, which is the carrier for glucose, blood sugar, in your bloodstream to push it into the cell. Now, resistance doesn't happen the same across the body everywhere. When we are insulin resistant, it starts in the muscle tissue. So the muscles that move you, your legs, your hips, your thighs, a little bit in your arms, yes, your back, those muscles become insulin resistant. And that is your biggest area to deposit your caloric intake. So that is where your blood sugar goes to get burned. So when we become insulin resistant, it starts in the muscle tissue and then it starts through the body. So the liver becomes insulin resistant. And so then the body is no longer a fat burning machine. It is now a glucose making machine because that's what the liver does when the liver becomes insulin resistant. And then in the brain, if the brain becomes insulin resistant, we start to see cognitive issues because the brain's primary fuel is going to be glucose. Unless you are a massively good fat burner and you make a lot of ketones, your brain is going to be starving if you can't make ketones. And if your liver is insulin resistant, you're not going to be really good at ketones. So when we look at insulin sensitivity, it may help improve insulin sensitivity. Most of the study was looking at, interestingly enough, testosterone administration in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome. One of the studies done in 2019 in Whom Reproductive Update, and this was a systematic review of meta-analysis and randomized control trials. Now, polycystic ovarian syndrome is associated with an excess of androgens, particularly androstenedione and androsterone and potentially DHT, which is a derivative of testosterone. And so what the take-home message here is, depending on where you're at in that time period, whether you're perimenopausal or menopausal, adequate replacement of testosterone because it helps the appropriate muscles start to become more insulin sensitive, particularly if you're exercising. So if you're exercising, and you're using testosterone therapy appropriately, you can become more insulin sensitive. Now, if you're getting testosterone therapy and you are a couch potato and you're insulin resistant, it doesn't work the same way. And so it can help improve that insulin sensitivity when done correctly. Now, skin health. Okay, so most hate that we're getting wrinkles. I know I stare at myself in the mirror and I'm like, oh my gosh, what's up with those lip wrinkles? Why is that there? It's a part of the aging process. We all go through it, right? We can fight it, and I fight it as hard as I can, but skin health is really important. So testosterone contributes to skin thickness and elasticity, and also moisture in the skin because it stimulates the sebaceous glands, which produce oils in the skin, to help keep the skin supple and moist. So when we start to lose testosterone and estrogens, our skin gets dry, gets paper thin. We lose the fat pad and the collagen production underneath the skin, and we start to get this sort of saggy jaw and the wrinkling. So testosterone absolutely helps contribute to that skin thickness and elasticity, particularly in women. So when we support it, we get that balance and we get better skin health for sure. Now, if you get too much, right? You get too much, you might get acne, you might get sebaceous dermatitis, which is the sebaceous glands where you might get a little bit of bumps and things along the hairline. And then if you get too much, you can also get some hair loss as well. So it's about appropriate dosing of testosterone, but it will thicken the skin and actually improve skin texture and moisture. Now, energy levels. If I were to say that there's one universal thing that all women want, is more energy. And it's probably because we're doing too much for everybody else and we've got the candle burning at both ends and we want to get a lot out of life. So energy levels are so very important, and testosterone may help improve energy levels by reducing fatigue. And part of this actually helps raise and balance some other hormones like growth hormone. And because it helps improve body composition, muscle mass, glucose utilization in the muscle, making your powerhouses in your cells more efficient, which makes you make more muscle, which makes you mitochondria, which is your powerhouses. So it becomes self-fulfilling. We get more energy. So it helps reduce fatigue. In the brain, it also helps reduce fatigue by improving dopamine signaling and dopamine receptor activity, which is important for attention, focus, and awareness, and that sense of anticipation and joy. So testosterone is helpful in that. And we've had, research all the way back to at least 2010. I know Miller and their group in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism published a study in 2010 called Testosterone Treatment in Adult Women with Growth Hormone Deficiency, Improvement in Body Composition, Plasma Testosterone, and Quality of Life. So we've known this for a long time. So energy levels are also improved. So what is your ultimate take-home message here? So the first thing is we have a long way to go with gaslighting of women's health in the US and across the Western world. And the idea that women don't need hormones because it's just part of the aging process, I personally don't agree with that. Yes, in 1900, our average lifespan was 57 years old. So it didn't matter if you kind of nosedive between 50 and 57 and didn't have any hormones left. You didn't have much life left. But I don't know about you. I don't want to live 30 to 40 more years with basically a massive decline in the things that keep me young, help my energy level, help me keep from getting osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, all of those things. I don't want to experience that. And testosterone is a big part of that picture. And like I said, we make 3 to 5 times the amount of testosterone in a woman than we do estrogen at any given time. And when you look at your labs, the reason why it doesn't look that impactful is we're actually using a different unit of measure. And so the reality is we can't wait for the FDA to, basically get their head out of their butt and understand that women's health is important and testosterone is a part of that. We need to help educate women and help you understand how to apply these things and how to work with your practitioner or find a practitioner that can help you navigate your hormones through this transitional period and beyond. Because if we look at mortality, the active through menopause increases our risk for all-cause mortality. It's not just the aging process. It's not just the numbers getting older. It's the actual act of losing those hormones. And testosterone is a player. So I hope you found this to be a valuable episode of Menopause Mastery. And I hope you've got some armament now so you can share that with your practitioner. Or if you don't have one, it's time to get one. All right. I will see you next week. Thanks and have a great week. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.